The room fell silent the moment Susan Bell walked in, her presence like a shadow lingering in the corner. For the past 3 years, she hadn't set foot in this boardroom, not since being removed from the executive team for being lacking in digital vision. The irony was hard to miss. While the room buzzed with talk of digital transformation and market forecasts, Susan had been quietly watching, learning, analyzing, and waiting for this moment. Today, her silence would speak louder than all the noise. This was the kind of meeting where dreams were either made or broken. 3 years ago, Susan Bell had sat at the head of the table, her fingers tapping lightly against the polished surface as she reviewed the quarterly report. She had always been the voice of reason, the realist in the room. But the digital age was rising fast, and the new CEO, Greg Turner, had a different vision. "Technology is the future, Susan," he'd said, his voice sparkling with the overconfidence of a man freshly handed the reins. "We're moving to the cloud, automating everything, and you're still talking about spreadsheets." She pushed back. She always pushed back. But this time, her voice didn't carry enough weight. The boardroom was full of young faces, eager, driven by the belief that innovation meant change for the sake of change. They didn't understand her caution. They couldn't see that in the rush toward the future, you could lose the very systems that made the present work. But her argument didn't matter. They voted her out. The exit was swift, cold, and calculated, a business decision with no room for sentiment. Susan Bell, who had helped build the company from the ground up, was no longer part of its future. Since then, she had retreated to the quiet of her home office, reading, analyzing, and most of all, waiting. She watched as the company slowly weakened, profits dipped, and Turner's grand vision crumbled under the weight of his own missteps. All the while, she kept her distance, letting the cracks grow deeper, knowing that truth always has a way of surfacing. Today, she had come back to face them. At first, Susan had no intention of speaking. She simply wanted to observe, watch Turner as he proudly presented the latest financial projections to shareholders, boasting of growth that felt hollow to her. But just before the break, she quietly placed her own report on the table. Nothing flashy, just hard data. Numbers that couldn't be ignored. The room fell into an uneasy hush as the CFO began to examine the figures, his brow furrowing in confusion. Susan's financial analysis, a set of unadorned spreadsheets and projections, wasn't just a report. It was a death knell for Greg Turner's tenure. She had dug deep into the company's tech investments, uncovering wasteful spending and exposing damaging partnerships Turner had championed. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about survival. And as the truth slowly came into focus for the shareholders, Susan Bell stood still in the corner, a silent observer, eyes locked on Turner. The next moments played out like a slow-moving nightmare. The shareholders began to murmur, glancing between the CFO's report and Susan's analysis, then back to Turner, who now sat frozen, his expression shifting with every second. She didn't need to say a word. The numbers had already spoken. The same CEO who had once taken pride in his so-called innovative decisions was now staring down a truth he could no longer deny. His rushed, arrogant choices had led the company into decline, while the ideas Susan once proposed, and they had dismissed, now revealed themselves as practical, forward-thinking, and grounded in reality. As the board began to dig into Susan's findings, Turner tried to recover, but it only made things worse. His excuses came fast, repetitive, nothing more than the same hollow justifications. But words couldn't undo what had already been exposed. Greg, one of the major shareholders, David Reinhardt, finally said, his voice cutting through the room, "We need to have a serious discussion about these points." He gestured toward the screen, where Susan's data now illuminated the failures of Turner's digital strategies. "There's no denying what's happened under your leadership. We need another solution." Susan watched, her expression unreadable. She knew this wasn't the time to talk about the pain of being cast aside. It was too late for personal vindication. Today was about the company and the future she had seen clearly all along. All she did was stand up, slowly, eyes still fixed on Turner, now just a fading figure under the spotlight beginning to shift toward her. She didn't need to make a speech. A single financial report, paired with her silence, had been enough to bring Turner's reign to an end. As every eye turned to her, a faint smile formed on Susan's lips. This was a quiet victory for knowledge, for patience, for the kind of decisions that didn't need to shout to be right. Because in the silence, knowledge had always held the power to change everything. The tension gripped the room, not just because of the numbers, but because of the sheer shock of it all. A few seconds passed in stifling silence. The shareholders glanced at each other, unsure of what to say. They all understood that something big was shifting. They felt it, in the invisible current now surging between them and the CEO, like an unstoppable tide rising from beneath the surface. Only one person stood apart, detached from the unfolding fallout. Susan. She took her seat again in the corner, as before, silent, but with a storm of thoughts swirling within. She didn't feel triumph. Not in the way people usually imagine it. What she felt was peace. When Turner finally stood up, the usual confidence drained from his face. His words came out rushed and uncertain. I don't understand what you're all so worried about. This is just a temporary setback. I have a plan, I will. But no one was listening anymore. One by one, the shareholders began leaving their seats, no longer looking at Turner, but turning to each other, already discussing next steps. They spoke of saving the company, of leadership changes. Their eyes held no surprise anymore, only the cold clarity of people who realized they'd been misled for too long. Finally, Reinhardt, the largest shareholder, turned to Susan. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something that could no longer be denied. Susan, he said, his voice no longer rigid, we may need you to come back. This company needs sound decisions, not just digital connections. Susan simply nodded. There was no need to reply. She hadn't won because of strategy. She had won because she was patient. Because she had stayed silent long enough for the truth to come to light. She didn't need to say another word. Her knowledge spoke for her, and now all she had to do was make sure the company stayed on the right track. After the shareholder meeting, the room was still buzzing with chatter about the sudden shift. The shareholders were engaged in nonstop conversations, loud discussions centered on the company's future, and of course, on who would become the next CEO. But while everyone else was fixated on that seat of power, Susan sat quietly in the corner, as if she hadn't fully entered the game just yet. There was no need to rush. Susan understood that in a world obsessed with loud moves, silence often spoke louder than anything else. She'd had plenty of time to analyze everything, and now it was time to act, but not in the way people expected. After the meeting ended, Susan got a call from Reinhardt. We'd like to invite you to a private meeting, he said, his tone serious. This company needs someone like you, someone with real vision. Susan didn't need to think twice. She'd received invitations like this before. But this time, it wasn't about proving herself. It was about recognizing that this might be the only real chance to keep the company on the right path and out of the hands of those who lacked direction. Right after the call, she began preparing an even more detailed financial report. She didn't just look at the immediate numbers, she studied long-term trends, strategic relationships, and most importantly, she knew exactly what needed to be done to turn things around. Not through flashy promises of digital transformation, but through the kind of stability she could deliver, the kind rooted in proven, wise decision-making. When Susan stepped into the small conference room, she was no longer the woman who had been left behind. She didn't need to say anything grand. A quiet smile, a confident look, that was enough. Reinhardt had been right to call her back. The company needed her, and she needed it too. But this time, Susan wasn't here just to fix others' mistakes. She was here to lead, to guide the company forward. Not through noise, but through cautious, sound decisions. Susan, Reinhardt said as she sat down, his eyes shining with trust, we're ready to hear your plan. Susan didn't rush to reply. She looked him in the eye, then calmly laid out her detailed plan. Every number, every analysis, every strategy had been carefully considered. There was nothing flashy or loud about it. It was about stability, about restoring the trust that had been lost. No grand gestures, no over-the-top promises, just wisdom revealed through even the smallest details. By the end of the meeting, the direction was clear. And Susan didn't need to say anything else. In the days following the shareholder meeting, everything changed quickly. Susan received a formal offer from Reinhardt and the other major shareholders. They wanted her to return to the leadership team, not just in a symbolic role, but in a key position. She would be responsible for shaping long-term strategy and overseeing all financial and sustainability-related operations. When she accepted, there was no loud celebration. Susan wasn't someone who sought validation through applause. All she ever wanted was recognition for her ability and insight, not fame or power. She understood that the company didn't need a leader who just made noise. It needed someone with vision, someone who knew that real change doesn't come from impulsive decisions or flashy strategies, but from thoughtful, deliberate action. On her first day back at the company, Susan didn't make an announcement or hold a press conference. She simply walked into her office, sat down, reopened the old reports, and began planning the real changes that needed to happen. Susan wasn't one to deliver quick, dramatic turnarounds. She knew that big decisions should never be made in haste. Instead, she worked humbly and methodically, revisiting past strategies, some of which Turner had proposed but were ignored. She reevaluated everything from a different angle, analyzing each number, every minor shift, and assessing how it would shape the company's future. But what Susan hadn't anticipated was that the real shift wasn't just in the strategy, it was in the people. As the weeks passed, she noticed how employees began to see her differently. They realized Susan wasn't just someone with knowledge, she was someone who could help them spot the opportunities they'd been blind to for too long. Many of the staff, who had grown disillusioned and lost trust in the previous leadership, now felt a renewed sense of energy. Susan's silence was no longer seen as defeat, but as the calm of someone who truly understood what needed to change. A month later, during a small leadership meeting, Reinhardt sat beside Susan and looked at her with genuine respect. "We've truly found the right person," he said. "Thank you, Susan. We've found our path forward." She simply smiled, saying nothing. Things were heading in the right direction. But she knew the real work was only beginning. Even with recognition and early results from her strategies starting to take shape, Susan remained in no rush. The company still wasn't fully stable, and there was plenty left to do. Now all eyes were on her, but Susan knew that success doesn't happen overnight, especially after so many delayed decisions. The following weeks were filled with relentless work. Susan spent most of her time in the office, combing through financial reports from previous years, reassessing investments and half-finished projects. She met with every department, from finance staff to lower-level directors, listening to their challenges and insights. But there was still one major issue that couldn't be solved immediately: the company culture. Under Turner's leadership, a flashy but unrealistic culture of digital innovation had worn people out. Susan recognized that it wasn't just the strategies that needed to change, it was also how people worked, how trust was built, and how collaboration could be restored. One morning, as Susan walked into a meeting with the directors, she sensed something different. The room felt lighter, more open. The directors no longer looked at each other with unease or doubt. They were beginning to see each other as teammates again. Susan didn't say much during the meeting, but every question she asked made the directors reflect deeply. Her questions were simple but piercing, about what they were doing and how they could do it better. Her words made them realize that the company wasn't just lacking a clear vision, it lacked cohesion between departments. At the end of the meeting, as everyone stood to leave, one senior director, someone who had once opposed her, stayed behind and Susan shook hands. "I think we're finally on the right track," he said, unable to hide his admiration. That acknowledgement brought Susan a sense of relief, but she also knew the journey had only just begun. Step by step, she would need to rebuild trust, not just with the shareholders, but with her entire team, who had grown far too used to failure and instability. A week later, when the next quarterly financial report was released, the numbers began to reflect the shift. While the company still faced major challenges, it was clear they had started to turn things around. The shareholders began to see Susan as a true leader, not because she had some revolutionary strategy, but because she understood that real change often comes from tackling the most fundamental problems. For Susan, the company didn't just need a brilliant executive. It needed someone who could listen, someone who truly understood the individual needs and struggles of everyone across the organization. And that's exactly what she was doing, not chasing headlines or flashy innovation, but laying a strong, steady foundation for sustainable growth. Even with the promising early results, Susan understood the nature of the company, a place long accustomed to abrupt changes and bold, risky strategies. Staying the course wouldn't be enough. The top stakeholders, especially the board, had begun to ask, does Susan have the courage to lead real, transformative change? They weren't looking for someone to play it safe. They wanted to see if she had the full-spectrum leadership it would take to truly earn her place for the long haul. At a closed-door meeting with the major shareholders, Reinhardt posed a question that made Susan pause. "We need to see a bold strategy, not just stability. Can you deliver that?" It wasn't doubt, it was a challenge. Reinhardt wanted to see Susan step out of her comfort zone and prove that she could elevate the company to a whole new level, not just patch the holes left by her predecessor. Susan knew she was at a crossroads. She could continue the safe route, gradual reforms, incremental improvements. But that would never spark the kind of deep transformation the company so desperately needed. To prove herself and truly change things, she'd have to take risks, craft bold strategies that would reshape the company's future. Over the next week, Susan began meeting with senior executives and the strategy team to discuss a long-held vision, a full-scale digital transformation of the company. But with a twist. She didn't want to simply pour money into technology without a clear direction. She understood that what the company needed wasn't just new tech, but a complete transformation from the mindset of every employee to the operations of every department. She decided to launch a small but highly symbolic pilot project, a new customer platform that would combine cutting-edge technology with a personalized, human-first approach to customer care. The goal was to deliver a breakthrough user experience, something that would restore trust not just with customers, but with shareholders, too. When Susan presented the idea, the room shifted. The executives looked uneasy, not because they doubted Susan's capabilities, but because such a major leap came with unknown financial risks. "We're going to have to invest a lot in technology," one director said. "And there are a lot of unpredictable variables." Susan listened. She didn't push back right away. She knew risk always comes with opportunity. But the bigger danger, she believed, was standing still, always reacting, never leading. "Finally," she said, "if we don't take this risk, we're going to be left behind. And more importantly, we can't keep living in the shadow of old strategies. Let me lead this team forward and prove that we're capable of more." A long silence followed. Then, it seemed, a consensus began to form. Reinhardt looked at Susan and nodded. "You have my support." That was the turning point. Susan was no longer just the person cleaning up old mistakes. She had become a pioneer, a leader willing to push for real, bold change even in the face of fear and uncertainty. This bold move could be the key to helping the company reclaim its place, and Susan, the quiet woman who once stood on the sidelines, had stepped up to lead the charge. But as soon as she committed to the digital transformation project, Susan realized the strategy wasn't just about upgrading technology, it was a full-blown revolution in thinking. And behind her enthusiasm were the quiet but growing objections from conservative leaders and shareholders, those who had backed Turner, the former CEO Susan had replaced. They weren't going to embrace change so easily. One of the strongest opponents was Jeremy, the CFO, a man perpetually worried about financial risk and the company's ability to absorb such massive tech investments. Every time Susan proposed a new initiative, he was quick to point out the uncertainties, warning that the company wasn't strong enough yet for such a leap. "We need to be cautious with our resources," Jeremy stressed during a recent meeting. "Not every risk can be properly calculated." Susan knew his concerns weren't unfounded. But she also knew that if the company continued operating under the old mindset, they'd never move forward. "I'm not denying this is a bold move," she replied. "But if we're too afraid to take risks, we'll never have a real shot at change." Despite Susan's efforts to reassure and explain, the financial risks continued to loom large. The rest of the leadership team remained hesitant, torn between sticking with a conservative, low-risk path and embracing the chance for real growth. Once she realized not everyone was on board, Susan made an even bolder move. She called for a private meeting with the major shareholders. She needed them to understand her long-term vision, not just short-term profits, but sustainable growth that could redefine the company's future. When the meeting began, Susan came prepared. She didn't just present profit forecasts, she laid out a full vision of a connected digital ecosystem that would tie together customer service, sales, and data analytics. She made the case that only a strong, early investment in tech infrastructure would allow the company not just to survive, but to lead. And for the first time, those in the room began to see it too. She didn't shy away from the concerns that shareholders might have. She acknowledged that the project could face short-term difficulties, but emphasized the importance of long-term vision. "If we don't invest in technology now, we'll be left behind, not just in this industry, but in the entire rapidly evolving digital economy," Susan said, her eyes unwavering. The meeting dragged on for hours, but by the end, something had shifted in the way the shareholders saw Susan. They no longer saw just a tough, determined woman. They saw someone with a clear vision and a practical development plan, not just empty promises. One of the major shareholders stood up, clapped, and said, "You've made us believe in the future of this company. Keep going, Susan. You have our support." With the shareholders on board, Susan knew the company had officially entered a major turning point. But that also meant she would face enormous pressure and challenges from both within and outside the organization. Competitors weren't standing still, and every misstep could cost her and the company dearly. But Susan was ready. The real battle was only just beginning. Even with shareholder consensus, Susan couldn't afford to be complacent. She knew her digital transformation plan still faced countless challenges in execution. The leadership team had never truly adapted to such rapid change, and many of them remained hesitant about bold moves. In fact, during several subsequent board meetings, department heads continued to question the feasibility of the long-term strategy Susan had laid out. Reinhardt, although he had agreed to the plan, sometimes raised concerns about whether the company could maintain operational efficiency while overhauling its technology and workflows. One of their conversations happened early one morning, the air in the boardroom still cold, as if the company had yet to get past its initial hurdles. "You know, Susan, I've always supported you," he said, "but are we really equipped to execute this? There's just so much to do, and I'm afraid we won't meet shareholder expectations anytime soon." Susan responded calmly, "We can't run before we learn to walk, Reinhardt. But what we can do is make sure every step is calculated, with long-term goals in mind. Our leadership team needs to work together on this, even when it gets tough." As the project moved into the implementation phase, problems beyond Susan's control began to surface. The new tech systems didn't always run smoothly, and syncing operations across departments proved difficult. During the initial testing phase, some longtime employees, especially those deeply rooted in the company, were overwhelmed by the sudden changes. They struggled with new software, unfamiliar processes, and many felt like they were being left behind. A special meeting was held to address these issues. Susan stood at the head of the table, looking at her colleagues, and for the first time during this entire journey, she felt the weight of the tension in the room. But she knew this was the moment to assert her leadership. She couldn't afford to waver or lose confidence. "We can't go back to the old ways," she said firmly, her voice resolute. "What we're doing is investing in the future. And while the road is bumpy now, I believe we'll get through it. I'm asking everyone here to stay committed, to keep learning, and to embrace these changes in their day-to-day work." Slowly but surely, Susan's patience and determination began to take effect. She listened and supported struggling employees, organized additional training sessions, and fostered a culture of continuous learning. Departments began making incremental improvements, and the company started to see positive signs from the new technologies being implemented. Over the next few months, Susan faced not only internal issues, but also mounting pressure from competitors. Other companies in the industry were ramping up their digital initiatives as well. But Susan and her team never backed down. She knew that meaningful transformation took time, and with perseverance, her company could come out on top. The tension hadn't completely lifted, but Susan began to feel something more clearly. Her resolve wasn't just driving the company through hardship, it was solidifying trust among employees and shareholders alike. Though she had once been voiceless in the company's past, she was now proving that with knowledge, insight, and leadership, she could change the company's trajectory. The silence that lingered in the corners of the boardroom no longer felt like weakness. It was the quiet presence of a strong woman, ready to face whatever challenges came her way and to win. She was preparing for the next chapter in the journey, reclaiming true authority, not through words, but through action. Just as the digital transformation was beginning to show promise, a major disruption shook the company. Out of nowhere, the former CEO, Turner, the man Susan had replaced, returned and declared that he wanted to retake control of the company. Citing the lack of immediate profits from Susan's transformation project and the unimpressive short-term financial metrics, Turner rallied a group of shareholders back to his side. He tried to convince them that a return to what used to work would restore stability and security, especially in a volatile market. Susan knew she couldn't sit by and watch. This was her chance to prove that not everyone could manage what they didn't understand. Though the company's financials hadn't yet rebounded as expected, she knew this was just the beginning. The strategic debates between her and Turner made it clear they had fundamentally different visions for the company's future. Turner, with his conservative mindset, couldn't see that the company was facing a rapidly changing world, one where digital agility and innovation were the keys to survival. In contrast, Susan had built a sustainable strategy, one that, while not delivering instant results, aligned with long-term market trends and promised future resilience. A shareholders' meeting was called. As expected, Turner leveraged all his connections and tactics to gather support. The shareholders now stood at a major crossroads. On one side was Turner, who had once led the company through years of stability. On the other was Susan, who had initiated a risky but potentially transformative change. But Susan refused to let the pressure shake her. She decided she wouldn't rely solely on numbers and theories to win over the shareholders. She knew that this battle wasn't just about money. It was about changing how people saw the future and the company's ability to survive adversity. As the meeting began, the room grew heavy with tension. Turner stood there, confident, waiting for shareholder support. But Susan wasn't just watching from the sidelines. She stepped forward, carrying a stack of documents and detailed financial reports, data she had been preparing for a long time. "We're standing at the edge of a tremendous opportunity, not just for today, but for years to come," Susan began, her voice steady and unwavering. "I'm not just bringing you numbers. I'm bringing change. You may believe that everything needs to be stable right now, but think about the future. True stability requires transformation, and that transformation needs to start today. People in the room began to listen, though uncertainty still lingered in their eyes. Susan continued, analyzing emerging industry trends and pointing out the opportunities the company could seize if it committed to bold changes. She didn't stop at explanation. She brought examples of major companies that had succeeded after shifting to a digital business model. She emphasized, again and again, that if the company didn't act immediately, it would fall behind in an increasingly fast-paced global market. We can't afford to keep moving slowly while the world is accelerating faster than ever, Susan concluded. Her voice was confident, but it carried a sharp edge of challenge. Turner couldn't sit still any longer. He began to push back, trying to pull the shareholders back to his more conservative point of view. The meeting turned into a true battle of vision, and nothing would be decided until the last voices in the room had made their choice. The meeting stretched past 3 hours, and the air had become so thick with tension it felt impossible to breathe. Turner, who always exuded confidence, now clearly felt the pressure. The shareholders looked uncertain, conflicted between worry and doubt. Susan had done everything she could to prove the strength of her strategy. But she also knew that words alone wouldn't win this battle. So she made her move, a dramatic, game-changing twist no one in the room saw coming. Suddenly, Susan rose from her seat, ignoring the surprised stares around her. She walked to the projector screen, where the company's financial data was being displayed. Every eye in the room followed her. A long silence hung in the air. 1 second. 2. No one spoke. When the screen lit up, the company's recent financial figures came into view. But these weren't the numbers the CEO or shareholders expected. Susan had carefully prepared a detailed breakdown of investments and expenses. But most importantly, she presented one critical dataset that Turner couldn't ignore, an independent financial report revealing that under Turner's leadership, a major investment in new technology had been overlooked and underutilized. If caught earlier, this missed opportunity could have brought the company massive returns. This, Susan said, her voice cold and razor-sharp, is why we haven't reached our potential. This is the investment Mr. Turner ignored. And this is what cost the company a major opportunity. It's clear we've failed to keep up with the industry, and that failure falls squarely on current leadership. But Susan didn't stop there. She showed comparative charts, clearly illustrating how competitors had surged ahead by embracing digital transformation and adopting new technologies aggressively. The room started to realize that this wasn't a minor oversight. It was a massive strategic misstep that had held the company back for years. Turner stood frozen. The confidence drained from his face, replaced by confusion and fear. He tried to respond, but no argument could counter Susan's data or the sharp clarity of her points. With that move, Susan hadn't just defeated Turner in theory, she had delivered undeniable proof of his strategic failures. The shareholders, once hesitant, now began to shift their stance. The truth was plain to see. Susan was the one with vision, with financial acumen, and with the ability to lead. So, Susan continued, showing no sympathy for Turner, I ask you to reconsider your decision. We're standing at a crucial crossroads. It's time to choose sustainable growth over the illusion of stability Mr. Turner has offered. With a dramatic reveal and razor-sharp analysis, Susan not only defended her strategy, she reclaimed leadership of the company. The shareholders sat in silence for a long moment, then, one by one, began to nod in agreement. The tone in the room shifted decisively. The meeting ended in a silence that was almost eerie. Turner, with no other choice, was forced to step down. And Susan, without shouting, without spectacle, had flipped the script and taken back control of the company that had once cast her aside. After the storm of that tense shareholder meeting, the room felt like the eye of a hurricane. In just a few hours, Susan had not only turned the tide, she had changed the entire trajectory of the company. The shareholders, once doubtful, now clearly saw that the innovation Susan represented wasn't just necessary, It was the only viable path forward. As the meeting ended, Turner walked out without saying a word. His shame was undeniable, and his resignation felt inevitable. Susan, meanwhile, felt no triumph, no glee. She understood that this victory wasn't the end. It was just a turning point on a much longer journey ahead. In the days that followed, Susan received countless messages of congratulations from shareholders and former colleagues. They admired her intelligence, her composure, and the sharp way she had handled the entire situation. But for Susan, the greatest reward wasn't external praise, it was the quiet confidence of knowing she had done the right thing. The next step was executing the digital transformation strategy she had carefully mapped out. She began strengthening her team, recruiting new talent who could help her lead the company through this critical phase. The challenges were still immense, but to Susan, each one was now an opportunity to prove the power of knowledge and resolve. One late afternoon, as she sat in her office looking out the window at the golden sunset over Boston, Susan thought about everything that had happened. The years had passed, years filled with challenges, growth, and hard-earned lessons. Susan knew that knowledge, even if forgotten or dismissed for a moment, remained the most powerful key to unlocking new opportunities. With calm resolve and quiet determination, she returned to work, once again drawing up long-term strategies for the company. No one knew she had once been pushed aside and disregarded, but everyone now saw the strong, intelligent, and resilient Susan Bell who would guide the company through whatever challenges lay ahead. Susan's story wasn't just a testament to the power of knowledge. It was a lesson in perseverance and the refusal to give up, especially when you believe in your own worth and your ability to change the world around you. When Susan officially resumed leadership of the company, she understood that the necessary changes wouldn't happen overnight. Winning the shareholder vote was a major milestone, but it was only the beginning of a long and demanding journey. The market and the industry were evolving rapidly, and if she didn't act decisively from the start, everything could slip back into the old patterns, back to the way things were under Turner's leadership. In those early days as the new CEO, Susan focused on rebuilding the leadership team, especially those with vision and the capacity to embrace bold changes. She brought in digital transformation experts, people with experience and foresight to help elevate the company to the next level. She didn't just change how people worked. She created an environment where sharing ideas and innovation were welcomed, something that had been nearly impossible under Turner. Her initial meetings with department heads were tense. Even though she had proven her capability and resolve during the fight against Turner, she now had to work alongside individuals who had once stood firmly in Turner's camp. Some of them were still skeptical of the changes she was implementing. But Susan didn't shy away from the challenge. She knew that abrupt transformation was never easy, but believed that by delivering results and making clear, thoughtful decisions, she would gradually win people over. One of her first major moves was to reform the technology division. The company needed to swiftly adopt advanced technologies to streamline operations and develop innovative products. Susan introduced big data analytics, artificial intelligence, and cutting-edge project management tools to boost performance. She also proposed a strategic partnership plan with major tech firms to overhaul the company's infrastructure. But Susan never forgot the longtime employees, the ones who had stood by her from the beginning, who had worked tirelessly to pull the company out of its previous crisis. She knew that her success would have been impossible without the support of this loyal, dedicated team. That's why she didn't just focus on strategy and processes. She also prioritized building a culture of unity, one where every person felt valued and encouraged to grow. Under Susan's leadership, meetings became more efficient and transparent. She communicated clearly with both shareholders and employees, helping everyone understand the company's goals and why these changes were necessary. She continually emphasized that with every change came opportunity, and that without timely adaptation, the company would be left behind. Though the road ahead was still long and filled with uncertainty, Susan didn't waver. She understood that this journey wasn't just about rebuilding a successful company. It was about building a legacy, proving that knowledge and perseverance will always light the way for those who dare to dream and dare to change. Even as the company took steady steps forward under her leadership, Susan couldn't forget the difficult days behind her. Every time she reflected on the journey, from being ousted from the executive team to reclaiming control, a quiet yet profound sense of pride welled up inside her. She understood that every stumble and every setback had been a valuable lesson. And what truly mattered was how one stood up after falling. One evening, after the office lights had dimmed and only the soft glow of computer screens remained, Susan sat quietly in the conference room. She stared at the latest financial reports on the screen, feeling a quiet satisfaction as the company began to regain momentum. Yet within her still lingered a subtle unease, a question that wasn't easy to answer. Could she sustain this transformation over the long haul? The memories of being pushed aside were still vivid, the secret boardroom meetings held in her absence, the cold stares from former colleagues, and the crushing disappointment of being deemed obsolete in a world racing ahead with technology. But now, she had proven that knowledge, patience, and long-term vision were still the most powerful tools. She may not have had a voice in those past meetings, but today, she held a position no one could ignore. One of the most important lessons Susan learned from these trials was the power of confidence, not blind arrogance, but a confidence grounded in a deep understanding of herself and her work. She had learned to face criticism without losing her balance. Every insult, every dismissive glance became fuel. Rather than break her, those failures had made her stronger. During moments of fatigue, Susan often turned to the books that had accompanied her throughout her career, works on leadership, business strategy, and the stories of people who had risen through adversity. She believed that reading was a powerful way to expand one's vision and deepen knowledge. Because knowledge didn't just help you make the right decisions, it helped you understand the world more clearly. Still, there were times when the pages of a book couldn't offer enough comfort. On long, quiet nights, Susan sometimes felt the weight of loneliness pressing in. As the only woman in a leadership role, she knew she had to be twice as strong just to avoid being seen as weak. But in those moments, she found peace within herself. She reminded herself that leading a company wasn't just about numbers and strategies, it was about people. And it was empathy, perseverance, and a deep understanding of her team's needs that would truly allow the company to thrive in the long run. Though challenges still lay ahead, Susan felt she was on the right path. Changing a company required more than vision. It required a heart that could listen, and the courage to make the right choices, even in the face of resistance. She wasn't just proving her worth to the shareholders or the employees. She was proving it to herself. Day by day, under Susan's leadership, the company slowly began to transform. Small, steady victories emerged, and her confidence grew with each step forward. Susan knew that while the road wouldn't be easy, she had everything it took to walk it. Strong enough to move forward, to build a stronger company and a legacy to be proud of. Although Susan had achieved a great deal since returning to the leadership seat, she understood that real change is never a destination, it's an ongoing journey. Early successes didn't make her complacent, they only fueled her to work harder. She knew that every step forward had to be sustained, and at times, she'd face even greater challenges. A year after that pivotal shareholder meeting, the company had delivered impressive results, rising profits, improved industry reputation, and, most notably, a significant technological transformation. The digital tools Susan had introduced boosted productivity, reduced costs, and opened new business opportunities. Still, she was aware that not everyone had fully embraced the changes. Some members of the leadership team, despite the clear results, remained uneasy with the pace of change and lacked hands-on experience in the tech space. In response, Susan kept refining her communication style, organizing training sessions, and consistently explaining the critical role of digital transformation in the company's survival. She also began to focus on shaping the company culture. One of Susan's biggest goals wasn't just to turn the company into a well-oiled business machine, but to make it a truly great place to work. In department meetings, she encouraged creativity and innovation, inviting everyone to participate in shaping the company's development strategy. She wanted not just a high-performing team, but a close-knit community where people felt a sense of belonging and responsibility for the company's shared future. Still, Susan constantly faced the challenges every leader must endure. The tough calls on layoffs, the tense negotiations with partners, the struggle to balance short-term wins with long-term vision. But she never backed down. She had learned how to face small failures without losing faith in herself. Sometimes a wrong decision wasn't the end. It was an opportunity to learn and recalibrate. On a crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves fell across Boston's streets, Susan gazed out her office window and felt a deep, quiet peace. She thought about the long road she had traveled, from being sidelined and underestimated, to the moment she returned and turned the tide. She realized that, even with all she had accomplished, her mission was far from complete. Her journey was just beginning, and there was still so much more to do to build a stronger company and a more sustainable future. But one thing Susan knew for sure, she had discovered the most important truth along the way. Knowledge and perseverance had carried her through it all. She believed that if you never stop learning and growing, you can change your own destiny. And sometimes, it's not the grand decisions or bold moves that make the difference, but the quiet, consistent actions and the knowledge you gather along the way. Looking back, Susan knew she wasn't just the head of this company. She was living proof that even if you've been silent in the corner for a long time, as long as you have knowledge, you will always find a way to change the world around you. Through all the setbacks and upheavals, Susan came to understand that it was her knowledge and her ability to deeply understand people that helped her stand firm in the cutthroat world of business. She realized that success wasn't about being crowned overnight. It was about steady accumulation, relentless striving. Through her difficult journey, Susan learned that even when you have no voice in big meetings, even when you're overlooked, if your knowledge is solid, you still have the power to make meaningful change. Susan's story isn't just about reclaiming a lost role. It's a testament to the power a woman can hold when she puts her faith in herself and in what she knows. One of the deepest lessons she learned was this: sometimes we need silence to listen and to grow. But when the moment comes, there will be times when silence is no longer an option, and you must rise and speak to shift the course. Looking at everything now, Susan didn't just see a growing company. She saw a team that was united, a strong community where people felt valued. Every decision she made, whether restructuring the company or working with partners, was guided by a single ideal: to build a workplace where creativity and collaboration were truly valued. Still, Susan never let herself forget that not everyone welcomes change with open arms. She remembered being pushed out once, simply because she lacked a digital vision. She understood now that accepting and adapting to change isn't easy, but she also believed that when a leader truly understands the necessity of change and remains committed to learning, they will never be left behind. Every morning, as she looked in the mirror and reflected on everything she had overcome, Susan saw how much she had grown. She was no longer the quiet woman in the corner of the boardroom. She was a leader, someone with the power to create change, not just in the company, but in the lives of the people around her. She no longer needed to prove herself. She just needed to keep building, keep acting, and keep moving forward. That day, when she walked into the shareholder meeting, the admiring glances weren't just about the numbers. What people saw was a strong, steadfast, and deeply knowledgeable woman, someone who had shown that you don't need to speak the loudest to make the biggest difference. You only need meaningful actions and a heart unwavering in its mission. Susan had once stood silently in the corner of the boardroom, her presence barely noticed. But now, as she looked back, she saw a roadmap filled with challenges, but also lit with brilliance and success. She hadn't just reclaimed her place. She had built a stronger company, ready to weather anything. Over those years, Susan taught herself a powerful lesson: that change doesn't always come from grand gestures or loud revolutions. Sometimes it's patience, intellect, and relentless determination that spark the biggest transformations. She understood that to make real change in an organization, you don't have to be the loudest voice in the room or command attention with speeches. Sometimes it's your quiet strength and calm persistence that reveal your true power. The months of being dismissed, of being seen as irrelevant in a fast-changing world, those taught Susan that sometimes you need time to grow, to prepare, to gather strength before revealing your full potential. Her silence, the calm at her core, became the foundation for the powerful return that followed. Though her current success brought her satisfaction, Susan never forgot the hard days. The memories of being overlooked and underestimated had become her greatest fuel. She reminded herself often, those experiences weren't wounds, but badges of growth, marks that forged her strength. And because of that, she never allowed herself to grow complacent. She knew the journey was still ahead. The journey would never end. Susan knew that. Her company and its people still had many challenges ahead, and there was only one thing she was sure of. If they kept learning, kept creating, and kept adapting, they would always stay ahead. For Susan, change wasn't just about implementing new technologies or revamping financial strategies. What mattered more was creating a company culture where every individual felt respected, had opportunities to grow, and could contribute creatively. This, she believed, was the key not only to sustainable growth, but also to building an inspiring workplace. She had learned how to inspire her team, helping them see that their success wasn't just measured in numbers, it came from the relentless effort of the entire collective. Looking back, Susan understood that life never offers a smooth path. Every challenge, every failure, had become a foundation stone for the future. And what mattered most was this: no matter the circumstances, you have to believe in yourself and never give up on your goals. She hadn't just transformed the company, she had changed the way she saw the power of knowledge and perseverance. Susan's story wasn't about a woman who triumphed in the world of finance or technology. It was about a woman who realized that silence during difficult times wasn't surrender, it was preparation for a breakthrough. And sometimes, the greatest victory isn't about defeating others, it's about standing up, owning your life, and creating change from within. Her story wasn't just a lesson in leadership, it was a spiritual journey of rebirth and self-affirmation. Susan had not only proven her worth within the company, but had delivered a powerful message to anyone who's ever been cast aside. Knowledge and perseverance are the twin engines that can carry you through any storm. When she thought about everything she had overcome, Susan couldn't help but feel proud of what she'd accomplished. Once seen as someone who lacked vision, she had rebuilt not just the company, but also a new foundation for its people. Her efforts weren't just reflected in rising profits or shiny awards, but in the genuine relationships she had nurtured with colleagues, with partners, and most importantly, with herself. She knew that in a constantly changing world, no success could last without continuous learning. And throughout that journey, Susan had come to understand this truth: whether you're a leader or a follower, you must recognize that change is inevitable, and your ability to embrace it is what determines your survival. To Susan, the most important lesson of all was this: you don't always have to speak up to be recognized. Sometimes it's quiet action, steady persistence, that changes everything. Sitting out the noisy debates or staying silent in a crowded room didn't mean she lacked a voice. On the contrary, that silence gave her the space to observe, to learn, and when the moment was right, to speak words that truly mattered, words that could make the world stop and listen. Today, looking back on all she had achieved, Susan felt a deep sense of pride. She had done what once seemed impossible. She hadn't just reclaimed her place, she had helped the company grow stronger and more resilient in an unpredictable market. She understood now that even when life pushes you into the corners you didn't choose, as long as you stay patient, stay clear-minded, and never stop learning, you'll always find a way forward. Susan's journey had become a symbol of the strength that lies in intellect and determination. She was living proof that if you just keep going and refuse to give up, anything is possible. And along the way, silence was never weakness, it was the quiet force that fuels the fire inside. In the end, her story wasn't just about business or financial success. It was a long and winding journey in search of understanding, self-worth, and rebirth through failure. And when we truly understand that knowledge and patience are power, we begin to see that no matter the odds, we all hold the potential to create meaningful, lasting change.